Handmade dice aren't just a singular color or perfectly smooth. Some of the best handmade creations are the ones that will test the boundaries and do things that you can't make at scale. Take this beautiful jumbo Midnight Coup D20 with silver leaf and different inking and everything else mixing up. Or this very pretty D6. The dice with inclusions in them are pretty much what really define handmade dice and are the kinds of things that people really crave. These are my best sellers. But this wouldn't be a video if I'm just making something that I've made 100 times over. This is about learning the process. So let's work with a brand new inclusion that I've never worked with before that's far heavier than this silver leaf, and a brand new die that's going to do something very special if it actually works. And talk about a good way to include sometimes extremely heavy things in your handmade dice for D&D. All right, let's talk casting dice. Last week was all around the finishing process, but I even got a couple comments in the video saying, why did you skip over making the dice set? And that's because I wanted to do it in this one. This video, we're gonna be working with these extremely large black mica / metal flakes. They are the heaviest inclusion I've ever worked with and by far the most rigid. That's gonna cause some problems a little later, you'll see down the line. I'm also using this new die, which has some special properties I don't want to spoil just yet, as well as the standard process, my silicone molds, my gloves, pipettes, stirring sticks, and the silicone mixing cup. So I start this by putting the inclusion in the mold first, and there's two reasons why I do this. One, it's way easier and you're not on the clock for the life of your resin before it hardens to have the inclusion in each die. Two, because it also is a lot cleaner. Trying to work with a half resin filled mold and opening it and putting the inclusions in and re-rubber banding it, you're just gonna get resin everywhere, and it's going to reduce the life of your tools that you're using to include things in. It also runs the risk of cross-contaminating resin back into your inclusion inside of its storage, and it's just bad overall. I thoroughly do not recommend it. And I do this because a lot of the inclusions I've worked with, like gold and silver leaf, are light enough that they can be near the bottom or near the edge, and I know I will be able to adjust them purely from the force of injecting resin into the mold via pipettes. Since these are so large and the dice themselves are so small, I only include 1 to 2 flakes in each of the smaller molds and about a half a dozen flakes in each of the larger ones. I then go ahead and start mixing my Art and Glow resin, my tried and true dice making resin, which I buy by the gallon now because you all have been so dang supportive of the dice making stuff. And I mix, well, let's do the math on this. I know a standard set of 8 dice takes between 30 and 35 milliliters of resin to completely fill and have excess in the reservoirs to avoid bubbling. I also know a jumbo D6 mold takes about 15 milliliters of resin for the same reason, depending on flash and inclusions and how much in the reservoir, and a jumbo D20 takes just under 20, but let's call it 20 because that's a nice round number. Adding these all up together, I get 80 milliliters, and that's exactly how much resin I'm going to make. Now, you're gonna see at the end that there will be the slightest bit left over, and I always over make slightly. I do this so that I don't run the risk of having resin that's been messed up everywhere and is being stored in pipettes and caught on the walls of the cup and just unusable for pouring or for molding. I don't want to get to the end of a set of dice and fail to be able to complete them or have a large air cavity in one because I was extremely tight on my margins. Giving myself a little bit of safety is what keeps me sane. Art and Glow resin, like many other epoxy resins, is 1A to 1B by volume, so it's 40 milliliters of part A and 40 milliliters of part B. Stirring vigorously on all 3 axes, as you've heard me say, just like with the silicone, it's time to add the ink. I use this special new resin inclusion resin dye, and I add about 6 drops, and it doesn't really look the best. So I add about 6 more, and still not exactly getting the color I want. Okay, so unexpectedly, despite this dye looking extremely opaque, it doesn't really give a lot of color to the resin. This is 10 drops, and it's at the point where if I need to add another 5, I'm afraid I'm going to start interfering with the cure of the actual resin. So we're going to combine it with something that I am used to that seems to have a lot more intense color. So let's just do a quick little before and after shot. This orange before this, I'm just going to put in one. The nozzle's a little touchy. 2, 3 drops of this stuff. Does not take a lot. Do a quick mix up. And I don't know how well the color range on the iPhone is going to pick this up, especially through a opaque silicone container. But it is a far more intense orange color. Hopefully I can do a quick before and after shot. This is what I'm hoping for, and you'll see the reason why I'm using both dyes near the end of the video. So, time for pouring. I realized that this is part there, part up there as far as the video. Hello, up there. For these larger D20 molds, I can still use my pipettes to do all of my filling. It's just gonna take a while. And I cut these larger D20 and D6 molds so that I can have enough of a lip and a gap while it being mostly sealed on the bottom that I can fill it halfway or better. Now you see the reason for the second silicone cup. I don't want to waste any resin, so let this drain off, but I am on my clock for my resin life cycle, and I can't waste time with extremely long pipette filling times. So pop that in there, lift this up slightly, just enough to provide an air gap, and pour in for the first half, give or take, of each of these larger molds. Then come back with that same rubber band that we had earlier and secure it on. And look at that, we're already pretty much halfway. Now, all the flakes get pushed to the bottom when you do it this way. So we're gonna have to jam one of these pipettes down and in and inject underneath to prevent that. Or we could also just tilt the mold slightly, understanding it's going to leak slightly out of this hole, but doing that and mixing it. I'm gonna quickly pour our D6 along the same method. Just sinking a whole bunch of resin into that. Save time and pot life. This one almost completely filled, which is awesome. Rubber band it shut. And now using pipettes and a little bit of gravity assistance, get those flakes up and agitated into the rest of the resin while getting everything else filled at the same time. Pour pipettes, and now we're back to a somewhat more normal filling experience when it comes to my process. Now that I've filled the 2 larger molds, now it's time for injection molding. I fill the pipettes by just squeezing the top and sticking it down in the resin so it sucks in a bunch of resin via the vacuum that's generated. And what I do here for these and any dice where I have inclusions is I turn the mold upside down and just give it a little bump, shaking it to agitate the inclusions inside so they don't all just stick to the bottom of the die. I also have a special way of filling dice molds when I'm doing inclusions. That doesn't really work top down, so back to the face cam. Now the trick with working with these, especially if you're working with a heavier inclusion, is everything I've talked about already to make sure that your resin doesn't get too viscous to the point where it's really easy for everything to sink, but also trying to fill this at different angles. Instead of just top down, which I would normally do, I'm trying to fill this almost on its side until the last possible moment. So that way I can avoid gravity working against me and making sure that the inclusions I'm trying to have in this dice set aren't all just at the bottom right underneath the highest value. That might look good, even if it does happen to work out that way, but it's not what I'm going for. Coming back to it, I'm a little worried about the D6 and the D20. I made enough of a mess with the pipettes, so I'm gonna try something a little obscure. Something I don't normally recommend. That's reaching in and messing with your mold after you've filled it. I normally campaign against doing this kind of thing because you risk introducing air bubbles and or damaging your mold if you're not extremely careful. And that's why I'm being extremely careful. Going in and lightly agitating the contents of those mica flakes, bringing them just so slightly up from the lower walls to prevent the sinkage in these larger dies. We'll see if that makes the difference. We'll see if that little bit of extra resin right there prevents any air gaps from making their way in. Now, I've been trying to preserve my gloves because #quarantine life. These are shot right away. Once and done. So hopefully I'll get more soon, but now it's time for this to head off to the pressure chamber. Now it's time to get these into the pressure pot, and since I can't do this one-handed and record video, a little bit of editing magic, and the pressure pot is secured, closed up, and hooked up. I will cure these at 40 psi for approximately 14 hours before removing them from the pots. And with those in the pressure pot, we're pretty much on track for a 1-day sleep and then some brand new dice that we're gonna demold tomorrow. Whether or not the mica is gonna be on the bottom of the dice or through the whole thing is yet to be seen. So whether or not our effort worked. I need to clean up that mess, and I'll see you after one more sleep. Next day, it's time to pull these dice out of the pressure pot, which is now decked out with these awesome new stickers from Blue Mimic and Sweetie Fiddle. Thank you all. Grab these and run them over to my workspace that's right over in the next room. And initial looks, I'm starting to get a little bit nervous. It looks like all of the heavier mica flakes sunk to the bottom, and I wasn't as lucky with these as I am with the lighter foils. Kick off to a quick little montage from the top where I pull each of the dice from their mold and clip them off using the little clippers that I rely on. If you want more information on this, I do have a more detailed video earlier. The process of clipping and trimming the dice is relatively unchanged from the earlier model. I also wanted to make sure I had something good to show, so I made a couple of these Sunken Treasure D20s, which look so nice. And here is the whole set. Now, there is sinkage problems with the heavier material, but overall the orange and black contrast is something that I like, but I don't love. I was hoping for a more reddish tint with this, and despite this being said red on the bottle, it definitely isn't. Plus, with the heavier flakes having the sinkage issues that you've already seen, as well as a couple bubbles, which is more of a problem than I've dealt with before, probably by air trapped by the heavier pigments that resin wasn't initially able to get into, and then couldn't escape from the molds during the pressure casting process. Overall, I'd give the flakes maybe a 5 out of 10 as an inclusion. It was a whim that I tried, but I'm gonna look for something a little bit lighter and more foil-like, and for now, it's a bit of a strikeout. But there is something that's super cool about this dice set, which I've been waiting until now to show you. Now, you might have caught when I said that I was very excited to work with this die for a brand new reason. It did something I've never done before. And while I kind of struck out on the mica flake placement and everything sunk to the bottom, and we'll work on better inclusions for the heavier materials, I'll stick with things like my Sunken Treasure, which seems to work just nicely for now. The thing that I was excited about with these was kind of unique. They glow in the dark. It's a special UV reactive pigment that will give off a slight orange glow, which if I brought the light down any darker, you wouldn't be able to see me on video, but these would be glowing brighter. But with this, you can see just how much they carry UV light and how just freaking cool that looks. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, a positive rating would be extremely appreciated. I will work on refining using the heavier inclusions. And the dice are already falling off the table. But for now, this one is a bit of a bust. But I wanted to show you not only the successes, but the whole learning process, including the times where I mess up. So having cool, glowy dice like this is one success, whereas the Flakes, maybe not. We'll call that a net neutral. Till next time, be good to each other, and I'll see you around. Let there be lights.